Welcome to Nachtmeier Witness. Some nights feel wrong before anything happens. The air feels heavy, the room feels colder, and somewhere in the dark, you get the strange feeling that you are being watched. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who became witnesses to things they never expected to see. Some saw someone standing in the shadows. Some heard voices with no one nearby. Others found themselves in places that did not feel real at all. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a slow, dark atmosphere, subscribe to Nachtmeier Witness. Get comfortable. The night has already begun. When I was a soldier several years ago, my job was not the kind of thing people usually imagine when they think about war. It was not always loud fighting, open battles, or clear enemies in front of us. A lot of the work happened in the shadows, in dangerous places where one wrong movement, one wrong road, one person saying the wrong thing could get someone killed. My job was to help recover and extract people from places where they were no longer safe. Sometimes they were citizens of my country. Sometimes they were people who had helped us. Sometimes they were people who had information that mattered so much that getting them out alive could change everything. It was a job built on risk, silence, and trust. You had to move fast, but you also had to move carefully. You had to care about the person you were going to get, even if you had never met them before. Because by the time your team was sent in, that person was usually already in more danger than most people can imagine. There are some missions I remember because of the planning. Some I remember because of the fear. Some I remember because of the relief when we got someone out and saw them realize they might actually live. But there is one mission that has stayed with me for almost a decade. And not because it ended with relief. It stayed with me because it showed me something about human cruelty that I still cannot understand. I have seen violence. I have seen what war does to people. I have seen people hurt, broken, terrified, and desperate. But this was different. This was not just killing. This was hatred shaped into an act so cruel that even years later my mind still turns away from it, as if it cannot fully accept that another human being chose to do it. There was a foreign woman who had been in contact with our intelligence service. She was not just some random person caught near danger. She had reached a point where she was willing to help us with information that could lead to a terrorist. That kind of decision is not small. People outside these situations often talk about information like it is just words, just names, locations, meetings, phone numbers, routes, or faces. But in places controlled by violent groups, information can be a death sentence. If you know something and the wrong people learn that you know it, your life can become very short. If you choose to give that information to another country or an intelligence service, you are not only taking a risk, you are stepping into a world where trust is thin and punishment can be worse than death. The agreement was simple in the way these things can sound simple from far away. She would help us. She would give information that could help us hunt down a terrorist. In return, we would reach her, extract her, and get her to safety. She could receive French nationality and spend the rest of her life somewhere safe. That was the promise in front of her. A new life. A safe place. A future where she would not have to wake up listening for footsteps outside her door. A future where she would not have to wonder if someone had found out what she had done. She was taking a terrible risk, but there was hope attached to it. That hope is what makes the ending even harder for me to live with. Before a mission like that, you build a picture in your head, whether you mean to or not. You think about the person you are supposed to find. You think about where they might be hiding, what condition they might be in, how scared they might feel, how quickly you will have to move, and what can go wrong. You do not let yourself become too emotional, because emotion can slow you down or cloud your judgment. But you also cannot fully remove the human part. Somewhere out there was a woman who trusted that we were coming. She had made contact. She had given something, or was ready to give something, that mattered. She was waiting for the chance to be taken out of danger. She was waiting for the promise of a safer life to become real. In those situations, time is always the enemy. Every hour increases the risk that someone notices something. Maybe a neighbor sees movement. Maybe someone talks. Maybe a phone call is intercepted. Maybe a person who seemed trustworthy is not trustworthy at all. Maybe the people hunting for her are already closer than anyone knows. You try to move before the net closes. You try to reach the person before fear turns into capture. And you always know there is a chance you will arrive too late. But knowing that in theory is very different from seeing it in front of you. We found her dead. Even now, that sentence feels too small for what it means. It does not hold the weight of the place, the silence, the smell, the shock, or the way everyone in the team understood without needing many words that we had failed to reach her in time. We did not fail because we did not care. We did not fail because we did not try. But the result was still the same. She was gone. The woman we had come to extract, the woman who had risked everything for a chance at safety and a new life, had been found by the people she was trying to escape. Somehow they had spotted her. I still do not know exactly how. Maybe someone betrayed her. Maybe she made one mistake. Maybe they were already watching her. Maybe the danger had been closer than anyone understood. That is one of the things that still bothers me. In these kinds of stories, people want to know the exact point where everything went wrong. They want a clear answer. But real life does not always give you that. Sometimes all you know is that someone who should have been hidden was discovered. Someone who should have been protected was reached first by the enemy. Someone who had placed her trust in a plan was left in the hands of people who had no mercy. What they did to her is something I do not like to describe. The short version is that they tortured and murdered her in a way that was meant not only to kill her, but to humiliate her, destroy her, and send a message to anyone else who might think of helping us. They violated her body in a way so cruel and so inhuman that even after all these years, I still cannot understand what kind of mind can choose that. It involved molten metal forced into her body. That is the detail that has stayed with me like a burn in my memory. I wish I did not know it. I wish no one had ever done it. I wish she had been found alive, frightened but breathing, ready to be taken away to the life she had been promised. But that is not what happened. There are some scenes that do not leave you as simple memories. They stay in your body. They come back through smell, through silence, through sleep, through a room being too hot, through a sound that reminds you of something from that day. Almost a decade later, I still have nightmares about it. Not every night, but often enough that I know the memory is still there, waiting. Sometimes the nightmare is not even an exact replay. Sometimes it is only pieces. The place where we found her, the heavy air, the knowledge that we were too late, the smell that seemed to get into my clothes and skin and never fully leave. Sometimes I wake up before anything happens in the dream, but the feeling is already there. The feeling that we are moving towards something we cannot stop. The feeling that someone trusted us and we did not reach her in time. People talk about war as if the hardest part is facing danger yourself. That is hard, of course. Fear for your own life is real. But one of the worst parts is finding what other people have done when no one stopped them. It is seeing the evidence of cruelty after the victim can no longer speak. It is standing in front of the result and understanding that there was a period of time when this person was alive, suffering, and alone with the people who did it. That thought is what breaks something inside you. Death is terrible, but the moments before death can be even worse to imagine. I think about her knowing she had been found. I think about her knowing we had not reached her. I think about whether she still hoped someone would come. That is the kind of thought that punishes you, because there is nowhere to put it. I have asked myself many times what kind of inhumanity a person needs to have to do something like that to another human being. I still do not have an answer. Anger is easy. Calling them monsters is easy. But even that feels like it does not explain enough. A monster in a story is simple. It is born to be evil, or it belongs to another world. These people looked human. They spoke human languages. They ate, slept, laughed, and moved through the world with faces like anyone else. And still, they were able to do that. That is what I learned that day more than any other day. Some people look human, but something essential inside them is missing, or buried so deep that they can no longer feel another person's pain as real. I know people say that dehumanizing others is dangerous, and they are right in many cases. But when you stand in front of what they did to her, it becomes very hard to use ordinary language. It becomes hard to say people without feeling like the word is too generous. I do not mean that in a simple, angry way. I mean that the act itself felt like a rejection of humanity. It was not enough for them to kill her. They had to make her suffer. They had to use her body as a warning. They had to turn their cruelty into a message. That is not just violence. That is a kind of moral emptiness that I still cannot fit into my understanding of the world. The mission was supposed to be about extraction. It was supposed to be about getting someone out. That was the image I carried before we arrived. Moving fast, finding her, getting her away from danger, maybe seeing fear in her face turn into disbelief when she realized she was safe. I had seen that before, that moment when someone who has been living under fear finally understands that the door is open. It is a powerful thing. It is one of the reasons people keep doing dangerous work. You tell yourself that if you can get even one person out, it matters. If you can save one person who risked everything, then the danger is worth it. But this time, there was no rescue. There was only a body and the knowledge that her chance had closed before we reached her. I think about the promise too. French nationality, a safe place for the rest of her life. Those words sound almost peaceful now, and that makes them painful. She might have imagined that life. Maybe she imagined a small apartment somewhere quiet. Maybe she imagined learning the language better, walking down a street without fear, buying food without looking over her shoulder, sleeping through the night without listening for men at the door. Maybe she imagined becoming someone new, or at least becoming safe enough to remember who she was before danger took over everything. That future was real enough for her to risk her life. Then the people hunting her took it away in the cruelest way they could. There is also a practical side of the memory that stays with me, because as soldiers we are trained to act even when we feel something. You still have a job. You still have to secure the place, gather information, report what happened, move carefully, watch for threats, and keep yourself and your team alive. You do not get to collapse in the moment. You put the horror somewhere inside you and keep moving. That is what training does. It helps you survive the scene, but it does not erase the scene. It only delays the payment. Later, when you are alone, when it is quiet, when your body finally understands there is no immediate danger, the memory comes back and asks to be felt. For a long time, I wondered whether I could have done something different, even if I know that is not a fair question. Could we have moved faster? Could intelligence have protected her better? Could someone have noticed She was compromised sooner? Could we have reached her 1 day earlier, 1 hour earlier? These questions are useless in one way, because they do not change the outcome. But trauma does not care if a question is useful. It asks anyway. It keeps searching for a version of the past where she is alive. It keeps trying to find the point where the story can be turned away from what happened. But the past does not move. It stays exactly where it is. The smell is one of the worst parts. People who have not been around scenes like that may not understand how much smell can stay with you. Images are terrible, but smell goes deeper. It bypasses thought. It brings you back before you can defend yourself. There are moments in normal life when something in the air catches me the wrong way, and suddenly I am not where I am. I am back there. I know I am not, but my body does not know it at first. My chest tightens. My stomach turns. My mind flashes to that day. Almost 10 years later, a part of me is still standing there, trying to understand how a person could do that to another person. I do not tell this story often because it is not the kind of story people know how to receive. It is too ugly. It does not have a lesson that makes anyone feel better. It does not end with justice in a way that heals the damage. It does not give the victim her life back. And sometimes, when you tell people about real cruelty, they look away because it is too much. I understand that. Part of me wants to look away too, but another part of me feels that forgetting her would be another kind of failure. She was not only a source, she was not only an asset, she was not only information in a file. She was a person who tried to help, who took a risk, and who paid for it in the worst way. That is why it still haunts me. Not because I had never seen death before, not because I did not know what terrorists and violent groups could do. It haunts me because she was so close to a different ending. She had made contact. A plan existed. People were coming for her. A safe life had been offered. She was almost out, or at least that is how it feels when I think about it. And then she was found first by people who had no human mercy left in them. That closeness to rescue makes the horror sharper. If there had never been a plan, it would still be terrible. But knowing that there was hope, that help was moving toward her, makes the failure feel like a wound that never fully closes. Some people think evil is rare, or dramatic, or easy to recognize. I do not think that anymore. I think evil can wear a normal face. It can sit at a table, make jokes, follow orders, and then do something so cruel that the rest of us spend years trying to understand it. That day taught me that there are people in the world who are not stopped by another person's screams, fear, or pain. They do not see a body as sacred. They do not see a woman as human. They see a message to send, a punishment to carry out, a tool for fear. And once you have seen the result of that kind of thinking, you cannot fully go back to the way you saw people before. Almost a decade has passed, but I still think about her. I think about the life she was trying to reach. I think about the information she had and the danger she accepted. I think about the moment she was discovered, and I hate that my mind goes there because no one should have to imagine it. I think about how we found her, and how the air felt around us, and how quiet everyone became, because there are some things even soldiers do not have words for. I think about the nightmares, the smell, and the question that has followed me ever since. What kind of emptiness does a person have to carry inside them to do that to someone else? This day, more than any other day in my life, taught me something I wish I had never learned. Some people are shaped like humans, speak like humans, and move through the world among humans. But they have crossed a line so far from basic humanity that I do not know what to call them anymore. I do not say that lightly. I say it because I saw what they left behind. I saw what they did to a woman who only wanted a chance at safety and a life away from fear. And even after all these years, I still wake up from dreams of that place, carrying the same horror, the same anger, and the same unanswered question. I have read a couple of books and court documents about this case, so forgive me, but this is one of those stories where I am about to become an unskippable cutscene. It is hard not to, because once you learn more than the short version, the whole thing becomes even worse. Not only because of what happened to Sylvia, which is already beyond heartbreaking, but because of all the small failures, broken family ties, missed chances, and cruel choices that surrounded her before and after her death. It is the kind of case where people usually want a simple answer. They want to know where the parents were, why nobody stopped it, how it was allowed to continue, and how so many people could be close to the situation without saving her. But the more you read, the less simple it becomes. Not because anyone is excused, but because the tragedy sits inside a mess of poverty, dysfunction, neglect, fear, bad timing, and people who either did not know enough, did not care enough, or were kept far enough away that they could not step in until it was too late. I want to say the parents tried, at least in some limited and damaged way. That does not mean they were good parents in the way Sylvia needed them to be. It does not mean they protected her. It does not erase what happened or make their choices okay. But from what I have read, they were not simply sitting comfortably somewhere while their daughters suffered and doing nothing on purpose. They were part of a deeply unstable family situation. They were carnival workers, moving around and living out of hotels in Florida while the abuse was taking place. That detail matters because it shows how unsettled the family's life already was before Sylvia and her younger sister were left in someone else's care. There was no strong, safe home base. There was no steady structure around them. Everything already seemed shaky, and that kind of instability can leave children vulnerable in ways that become dangerous very quickly. Sylvia was not the only daughter placed with the Banashevskys. Her disabled younger sister, Jenny, was living there too. That is another painful part of the case, because Jenny was there, witnessing and experiencing parts of the same terrible environment, while also being less able to protect herself or her sister. The parents reportedly did visit their daughters, but from what I understand, those visits seem to have happened before the abuse became as extreme as it later did. That is one of the most haunting parts of the timeline. There may have been a point where the situation looked bad, but not yet like the nightmare it would become. There may have been a point where the parents thought the girls were being cared for well enough, or at least not in immediate danger. And then, after they were gone again, everything began to slide into something far darker. From what has been said, the abuse started after the father's check to Gertrude for taking care of the girls came late. That detail is so small and so ugly at the same time. A late check, a money problem, a delay, something that should never have had anything to do with a child's safety. But in that house, it seems to have become the spark for resentment, punishment, and cruelty. Both girls were abused, but for reasons that still feel senseless, the Banashevskys made Sylvia the main target. They turned her into the scapegoat. There was no real reason for it, at least not one that makes any moral sense. She became the one they blamed, degraded, and focused their anger on. That is one of the things that makes the case so disturbing, how a group of people inside a house can decide, openly or quietly, that one child is the person they are allowed to hurt. Scapegoating is a terrifying thing, because it can become a kind of permission structure. Once one person is labeled as the problem, every cruel action against them can be twisted into something the abusers think is deserved. People who would never admit they are doing something evil can tell themselves they are punishing, correcting, teaching, or dealing with someone who caused trouble. That seems to be part of what happened to Sylvia. She was treated not like a child in need of care, but like an object for other people's anger. And because the house itself was so broken, the cruelty spread. It was not only one person acting alone in secret. Others were pulled into it, encouraged, allowed, or pressured to take part. That is what makes it feel almost impossible to understand. A child was being destroyed in front of people, and instead of stopping it, some of them joined in. When people ask where her parents were, the answer is painful, because it is not a neat answer. They were away, working and living in an unstable situation. They had left the girls with Gertrude. They reportedly visited before the worst period of abuse. They were informed about Sylvia's death and came back for the funeral, but they were not really involved in the court proceedings afterward. That absence feels awful, especially because court proceedings are where the truth was being dragged into the light. It is difficult to understand from the outside why they were not more present. Maybe grief, guilt, estrangement, poverty, shame, or dysfunction all played some part. Maybe they could not face it. Maybe they did not know how. None of that changes the fact that Sylvia deserved adults who were fully there for her, both before and after. The older sister, Diana, is one of the most tragic parts of the family side of the story. She was involved in a different way because she had tried multiple times to get into contact with her younger sisters. She wanted to reach them. She tried to see them or speak with them, but Gertrude forbade it. That detail feels important because it suggests that someone outside the house was trying to maintain a connection, and the person inside the house with control over Sylvia and Jenny blocked it. When people are abusing someone, isolation is often part of how they keep power. They do not want outsiders looking too closely. They do not want someone asking questions. They do not want the victim to have a clear path to help. If Diana had been allowed to see her sisters, maybe she would have noticed something. Maybe she would have sounded the alarm. Maybe nothing would have changed. But that possibility alone makes Gertrude keeping her away feel even more sinister. Diana's relationship with her parents adds another layer to the sadness. Apparently, she and her parents had a falling out and became estranged from them, though not from her siblings. It is unclear whether Gertrude actually knew the details of that estrangement. Maybe she did. Maybe she did not. But either way, it seems very possible that Gertrude simply did not want Diana around, because Diana might have seen too much. She might have questioned the condition of the girls. She might have refused to accept whatever explanation was being given. She might have gone to someone for help. In a case like this, it is painful to think about every person who might have interrupted the abuse if they had been allowed closer. That is one of the hardest things about the whole story. It is full of near misses, people who might have known, people who might have helped, people who saw pieces but not the whole picture, people who were told lies, people who were kept away, people who may have assumed someone else was handling it. In cases like this, the horror is not only the cruelty of the main abusers, it is also the way a child can fall through every crack at once. Family dysfunction, financial stress, social pressure, fear, manipulation, and neglect all create a space where the worst kind of person can do terrible things for far too long. The Banaszewski house itself has always felt like one of the most frightening parts of the story to me. Not because of what it looked like, but because of what it became. A house is supposed to be a place where children sleep, eat, do chores, argue, laugh, and live ordinary lives. But in this case, the house became a closed world with its own cruel rules. Sylvia and Jenny were not in some distant, hidden location where nobody knew they existed. They were inside a neighborhood. They were around people. They were close enough to normal life that it makes the failure even worse. That is what true crime often teaches in the most uncomfortable way. Evil does not always hide far away. Sometimes it sits in a regular house, behind regular walls, while people nearby go on with their days. The phrase hiding in plain sight fits this kind of case too well. People often imagine abusers as obvious monsters, people everyone can spot immediately. But many of them do not look like monsters to the people around them. They have friends, they have relatives, they have people who defend them. They can seem normal enough, or pitiful enough, or familiar enough that people make excuses for them. That is what makes cases like this so frightening. The danger is not always in the person everyone fears. Sometimes it is in the person other people protect, excuse, or refuse to believe could be that bad. What happened after Sylvia's death shows that too. People had to sit in court and listen to what had been done. The truth had to be spoken out loud, and still there were people willing to deny, minimize, excuse, or defend the people involved. That kind of loyalty to an abuser is something I will never fully understand, but it happens again and again. Friends and family show up, not for the victim, but for the person accused. They convince themselves the children are lying. They decide the stories are exaggerated. They protect the image of someone they know rather than face what that person may have done. That reaction can be almost as disturbing as the crime itself, because it shows how easily people can choose comfort over truth. The whole story is very, very sad. It is sad in a way that does not end with Sylvia's death. Some tragedies have one central moment, and everything after is aftermath. But this one seemed to keep echoing through the family for years. Jenny survived, but survival after something like that is not simple. She lived with what happened, with what she saw, and with what she endured. She died in her 50s, which feels young, especially when you think about how much pain had already been forced into her life when she was still a child. Her life was not only defined by the case, of course, but it is impossible to separate the shadow of it from what came after. The family's sons also suffered deeply. Both were said to have had severe mental illness. One died, and the other's whereabouts and status are unknown. That detail gives the whole family story a haunted feeling, not in a supernatural sense, but in the sense that trauma seemed to follow them. When a family goes through something that extreme, the damage does not stay in one place. It spreads through siblings, parents, memory, guilt, grief, and silence. It can affect people who were present, people who were not present, people who tried to help, and people who feel they failed. It can become part of the family history in a way that nobody can escape. The mother having newspaper clippings about the court case and about Gertrude's death in her possession when she died is one of those details that feels small but devastating. It suggests she never really left it behind. Maybe she could not. Maybe she carried the case with her for the rest of her life, folded into newspapers, saved in clippings, kept close even when there was nothing left to change. I do not know exactly what she felt, and I would not want to pretend I do. But it is hard not to imagine guilt, grief, anger, and obsession all mixed together. A mother lost her daughter in one of the worst ways imaginable, and even if she had been absent or had failed her, that loss did not simply vanish. It stayed. It followed her until the end. What makes Sylvia's case so unbearable is that she was not only killed, she was failed over and over before she died. She was failed by the adults who should have protected her. She was failed by the people who saw cruelty and did not stop it. She was failed by those who joined in. She was failed by a situation that allowed her to be isolated from people who might have helped her. And then, even after her death, there were people who still tried to defend the people who hurt her. That is a kind of horror that feels bigger than one house, because it says something awful about how communities and families can close ranks around the wrong person. And still, I think it is important to remember that Sylvia was more than the crime. That is one of the hardest things with cases like this. The details of the abuse are so shocking that they can swallow the person at the center. People remember the case, the court documents, the house, the cruelty, and the names of the abusers. But Sylvia was a girl before she was a victim. She had a family, siblings, a life, thoughts, fears, hopes, and ordinary moments that should have continued. She deserved to grow up. She deserved safety. She deserved adults who saw her as a child and treated her like one. The fact that she was turned into a scapegoat for no real reason makes the injustice feel even more senseless. The same is true for Jenny. She was not just a witness or a detail in her sister's case. She was a child too, disabled and vulnerable, living in the same home while the abuse happened. She lost her sister in the most traumatic way. She had to live afterward with memories no person should have, let alone someone who was so young at the time. When people talk about the case, Sylvia is rightly at the center, but Jenny's suffering is also part of the tragedy. She survived, but survival does not mean she escaped unharmed. The more you read about this case, the harder it is to look away, but also the harder it is to keep reading. That is what I mean by becoming an unskippable cutscene. Once you understand the family background, the delayed check, the way the abuse intensified, the isolation from Deanna, the parents being away, the court proceedings, and the long damage that followed, the story becomes more than a true crime headline. It becomes a web of human failure. Some people were actively cruel. Some were weak. Some were absent. Some may have been ignorant until it was too late. Some tried but were blocked. And one child paid the highest price for all of it. There is no satisfying ending. Gertrude died eventually, and Sylvia's mother reportedly kept clippings about it, but that does not balance anything. Prison sentences, trials, headlines, and later deaths do not undo what happened. They do not give Sylvia her life back. They do not restore Jenny's childhood. They do not heal the family. They do not erase the fact that a group of people decided a young girl could be treated as less than human, while others either helped, watched, or stayed away. That is why the story stays so heavy. It is not just the violence. It is the preventability. It is the sense that a different choice at any number of points might have changed everything. If the girls had not been left there, if the check had not become an excuse for cruelty, if the parents had visited later and seen the truth, if Deanna had been allowed contact, if someone nearby had understood what was happening, if one person inside that house had refused to go along with it and told the right adult, if the system had moved faster, if the case is full of those thoughts, and none of them can save her now. In the end, what haunts me most is how ordinary some of the setup sounds before it becomes horrific. Carnival worker parents away in Florida. Children staying with another family. A late check. An older sister trying to contact her siblings. A house full of people. Friends and relatives who believed the wrong side. These are not supernatural things. They are painfully real. They show how a child can become trapped in a situation that outsiders may not fully see until the damage is already done. And once you know the story, it is hard not to carry it with you. Not because it is entertaining, but because it is a reminder of how badly children need protection, how dangerous isolation can be, and how evil can survive when people choose not to believe the ones who are being hurt. The Aberfan disaster is one of those real events that feels almost too terrible to fully take in. It is scary in the most human way possible. not because of ghosts, monsters, or anything supernatural, but because it happened to ordinary children, ordinary teachers, and ordinary families who had no real warning and no chance to escape. It is the kind of tragedy that sits heavy in your chest, because you can imagine the village waking up that morning like any other day. Parents were getting children ready for school. Teachers were preparing for another normal morning. People were going to work, opening doors, making breakfast, walking familiar streets, and thinking about small daily things. Then, in only a few minutes, the life of an entire village changed forever. That is what makes Aberfan so horrifying. It was not only a disaster, it was a failure that people had warned about. It was a warning ignored, a danger left above a village until gravity, rain, and negligence turned it into a nightmare. Aberfan is a mining village in South Wales, and before the disaster, it was one of those places shaped by the coal industry in almost every way. The mines were not just part of the economy, they were part of the landscape, part of daily life, part of what families depended on, and part of what stood above them. On the mountains around the valley, coal spoil was tipped and piled up over time. Coal spoil is the waste material left over from mining, and in Aberfan these huge piles rose above the village. They were not small mounds tucked away somewhere harmless. They towered over the homes and streets below. For the people living there, those tips were always present, part of the view, part of the background, part of the world they had learned to live under. That alone is unsettling when you think about it. A village full of families sitting below massive piles of mining waste, depending on those in charge to make sure the land above them was safe. Most people do not have the power to move a mountain of spoil. They do not have the authority to change industrial policy or force a company to act. They have to trust that the people running these operations know what they are doing, and more importantly, that they care enough to protect human life. That is what makes the Aberfan disaster so deeply frightening. The people of the village were not facing a danger they had created. They were living below a danger created by industry, and the people responsible for that danger had been warned. For months before the disaster, there were signs that something was wrong. The coal tips were shifting. People who understood the area and worked around the tips had concerns. Firemen of the coal tips warned that the tips were moving, and they heard noises coming from them. That detail is chilling. A mountain of waste should not sound alive. It should not groan or shift above a village. When people hear a structure moving, when they see signs that the ground is unstable, that should be enough to make those in power stop and act immediately. But the warnings were not treated with the urgency they deserved. The danger remained where it was, above homes, roads, and a school full of children. In the weeks leading up to the disaster, the weather made everything worse. There had been heavy rainfall, and the rain did not simply run off the surface in a harmless way. It mixed with the natural streams of the mountain and began to erode the coal spoil from within. That is one of the most frightening parts of the whole event, because from the outside, danger can sometimes look still. A pile can sit there day after day and appear solid enough to people who do not want to look too closely. But inside, water can work quietly. It can soften, loosen, and weaken. It can turn something that seems fixed into something ready to move. In Aberfan, the mountain above the village was becoming unstable from the inside out. That kind of danger is terrifying because it gives people almost no visible countdown. There is no clear clock saying exactly when the collapse will happen. There is only the slow buildup of risk, the signs that something is wrong, and the terrible question of whether anyone in power will act before it is too late. In Aberfan, they did not act in time. The coal spoil remained above the village. The rain kept falling. The water kept working its way through the waste. The tips had already been warned about. People had already said something was wrong. And still, below it all, children kept going to school. The school is the part that makes the disaster almost unbearable to think about. Children trust the world in a way adults often cannot. They do not wake up expecting the mountain above their village to come down on them. They do not walk into a classroom thinking that the place where they learn, laugh, line up, and wait for assembly could become the place where their lives end. Schools are supposed to be safe. Even when children are bored, nervous, or tired, a school is meant to be a protected place. Parents send their children there believing they will come home. Teachers stand in front of classrooms believing their students will grow up. That trust was broken in the worst possible way. On the day of the disaster, it was around 9 in the morning. The timing makes it even more haunting. It was not the middle of the night when people were already asleep. It was not late in the day when children were on their way home. It happened in the morning, just as the children were preparing for school assembly. That image stays with me. Children gathered or getting ready. Teachers organizing the start of the day, the ordinary rhythm of a school morning taking place under a danger that was seconds away from arriving. The village had no warning. There was no alarm loud enough to save them. No one had time to run into the school and pull the children out. No one had time to move the village out of the path. The collapse came too fast. The tip avalanched down the mountain and crashed directly into the school. It was not just dirt or stones. It was coal slurry, a thick, heavy, suffocating mass of mining waste and water. It came down with enormous force, swallowing parts of the village and burying the school. The thought of it is almost impossible to sit with. Children and teachers who had been alive moments before were suddenly trapped beneath a crushing wave of black waste. The disaster was not clean or quick in the way people sometimes imagine accidents. It was a nightmare of weight, darkness, mud, water, and coal. People were buried where they had been sitting or standing. The school that should have protected them could not protect them from a mountain coming down. 116 children died. That number is so large that the mind struggles to understand it properly. It is not just a number. It is 116 children who had names, families, bedrooms, favorite games, school friends, small worries, and futures that should have stretched far beyond that morning. It is 116 children who were expected home. It is 116 empty places in houses across the village. It is 116 families shattered in a single day. And children were not the only victims, but that number alone shows the depth of the loss. People often say that Aberfan lost a generation of children, and that phrase does not feel exaggerated. In a small community, the loss of so many children at once is not something life can simply absorb. It changes the village forever. The parents' fear is another part that is hard to imagine. Some may have heard the sound. Some may have seen the black wave coming down. Some may have realized it was heading toward the school. Imagine being a parent in that village and knowing your child was there. Imagine running toward the place where your child should have been safe, only to find it buried under coal slurry. Imagine digging with your hands because tools are too slow and waiting is impossible. Imagine calling a child's name into a silence that gives nothing back. There are some kinds of fear that do not belong in ordinary language, and this is one of them. The teachers, too, were placed in an impossible horror. They had responsibility for the children, but no real chance to save them. Teachers spend their days managing small things, lessons, behavior, attendance, assembly, reading, writing, and making sure children are looked after until they go home. They do not expect to face an avalanche of industrial waste. They do not expect the building around them to become a tomb. The terror they must have felt in those final moments is impossible to truly understand from the outside. It is one of the reasons the disaster still feels so painful decades later. It attacked a place of learning, childhood, and community. And the worst part is that the village was given no warning. The people below the tips were not told in time to evacuate. The children were not kept from school. The parents were not told to keep them home. The teachers were not told to leave the building. The collapse arrived with brutal suddenness, but the danger itself had not appeared suddenly. That is the difference. The final movement of the tip happened fast, but the risk had been building for months. Warnings had been raised. Concerns existed. The land had been changing. The rain had been weakening the spoil. The disaster may have come like an avalanche, but it was not some random act with no history behind it. That is why the role of the NCB, the National Coal Board, makes the story even more frightening. It is terrifying when companies or powerful institutions value production, convenience, money, or reputation above human life. It is terrifying when people who live near danger are treated as if their safety is secondary. It is terrifying when warnings from those closest to the problem are ignored until the worst possible outcome happens. Aberfan is not only scary because of the physical disaster, it is scary because of the moral failure behind it. The people in charge had power. The village did not. And when the danger finally came down, it was the village that paid the price. There is a specific kind of horror in preventable disasters. Natural disasters can be terrifying, but when something is preventable, the grief becomes mixed with anger. People do not only mourn what happened, they ask why it was allowed to happen. They ask who knew. They ask who ignored the warnings. They ask why no action was taken when there was still time. In Aberfan, those questions are part of the tragedy. The mountain did not simply fall out of nowhere. Coal spoil had been placed there. The tips had been allowed to tower over the village. Warnings had been raised. Rain and streams had made the situation worse. And still, the children went to school beneath it. The aftermath must have been unbearable. Rescue workers, miners, parents, neighbors, and volunteers all came together in desperation. People dug through the slurry hoping to find survivors, knowing that every minute mattered. But the material they were digging through was heavy, wet, and suffocating. It was not like lifting dry earth. It was coal waste mixed with water, pressing down on everything beneath it. The rescue effort became a scene of grief almost immediately, because for so many children, there was no rescue left to give. People were not only trying to save lives, they were also uncovering the scale of the loss piece by piece. A disaster like that does not end when the bodies are recovered or when the news cameras leave. It stays in the community. It stays in the parents who survived their children. It stays in the children who survived while their classmates did not. It stays in the teachers, rescue workers, miners, and neighbors who saw things no person should have to see. It stays in the streets, in the homes, in the empty beds, and in the silence of a village that had lost so many of its young at once. The area lost a generation of children, and that kind of loss becomes part of the identity of a place. Aberfan became a name tied forever to grief, negligence, and the cost of ignoring warnings. What makes it even more bitter is that it took the NCB decades to properly admit fault. That adds another layer of pain to the tragedy. It is one thing for a disaster to happen, and for those responsible to immediately accept the truth, face the damage, and show real accountability. It is another thing for families and survivors to have to fight for recognition, for honesty, and for the basic acknowledgement that what happened was not simply bad luck. When powerful organizations delay accountability, they do not only fail the dead, they continue to hurt the living. They make grief heavier by forcing people to carry anger and disbelief alongside it. Aberfan is horrifying because it shows how ordinary people can be trapped beneath decisions made far above them, both literally and figuratively. The coal tips were physically above the village, but the power was above them too. Decisions were made by institutions, boards, managers, and systems that did not have to sleep beneath those tips with their children. The villagers lived with the risk. The children went to school under it. The people responsible had distance, authority, and the ability to ignore what others could not. That imbalance is part of the fear. It makes you realize how vulnerable communities can be when industry controls the landscape around them. I think about the morning again and again. Around 9 o'clock, children preparing for assembly, teachers getting the day started, parents believing their children were safe, the mountain above them soaked with rain, weakened from within, holding for one moment longer before it gave way. Then the collapse, the roar, the black wave, the school struck, the village thrown into panic. It is the kind of sequence that feels impossible because it moves from normal life to disaster too quickly. But that is how real tragedy often happens. The build-up can take years, but the final moment can take seconds. That is why the Aberfan disaster still scares people. Not because it is unknown, but because it is painfully understandable. We can see how the danger formed. We can see how warnings were ignored. We can see how heavy rainfall and natural streams weakened the spoil. We can see how the village sat below it. We can see how the children were in school at the exact wrong time. And we can see how little the people below could do once the tip began to move. The horror comes from that terrible clarity. It did not have to be this way, and yet it was. For me, the most disturbing part is the thought that the children had no warning. They were not given the chance to be afraid in advance, to run, to be held by their parents, or to understand what was coming. One moment, they were in the ordinary world of school. The next, the disaster was on top of them. That suddenness is what makes it so frightening, but the preventability is what makes it so enraging. A whole village paid the price for warnings that were not properly acted on. Families lost children because a dangerous industrial practice was allowed to continue above their homes. Aberfan is not just a sad story from the past. It is a warning about what happens when human life is treated as less important than profit, convenience, or denial. It is a reminder that communities should not have to beg to be protected from dangers created by powerful industries. It is a reminder that warnings matter, especially when they come from people who see the danger every day. And it is a reminder that when institutions ignore risk, the consequences are not abstract. They have names. They have faces. They are children sitting in a school in South Wales on an ordinary morning, waiting for assembly. That is why the Aberfan disaster remains so haunting. It was terrifying for the children, the teachers, and the parents. It was terrifying for the rescue workers and the village that had to live through the aftermath. But it is also terrifying because it shows a kind of coldness that can exist inside systems of power. The warnings were there. The danger was above them. The rain had made it worse. The tip came down around 9 in the morning and crashed into the school with no warning to the village. 116 children died in coal slurry, along with others who were caught in the disaster. The area lost a generation, and it took decades for full fault to be admitted. That is horror in its realest form, not something imaginary in the dark, but something built by neglect, ignored by authority, and paid for by innocent people who trusted that the world around them was safer than it really was. Before the next witness tells their story, take a moment to subscribe to Nachtmeyer Witness. This channel is for the late hours, when sleep is close, but the mind is still awake enough to notice every sound in the room. New true stories arrive here for anyone drawn to strange encounters, uneasy memories, and nights that never felt normal again. Leave a like if the stories have pulled you in so far. Now, let's return to the darkness. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, I went camping with my family in a small rustic cabin by a lake. It was the kind of place that looked peaceful when you first arrived, the kind of place people choose because they want to get away from everything for a little while. There were trees all around, water nearby, and that quiet feeling you only get when you are far enough from towns and busy roads that the normal sounds of life begin to fade. At that age, I did not think about danger the way adults do. I thought about the lake, the cabin, the fire, the bunks, and the feeling of being somewhere different from home. It felt like an adventure, not a dangerous one, just the kind of simple trip a kid remembers, because everything seems bigger and more exciting when you are young. The cabin itself was not fancy at all. It was one room, plain and rough, with the kind of basic setup you expect from an old lakeside cabin. There was a fireplace, a concrete floor, bunk beds on one side, and the door on the opposite side of the room. That was pretty much it. It was not built for comfort in the modern sense. It was there to keep the weather off you, give you a place to sleep, and let you feel like you were camping without being completely outside. The walls did not make me nervous at first. The concrete floor did not seem strange. The bunk beds were more interesting to me than anything else, because when you are a kid, bunk beds always feel special. Even a rough little cabin can feel fun when you are looking at it through the eyes of an 8 or 9-year-old. The lake made the place feel calm. During the day, everything seemed normal. The air smelled like water, wood, dirt, smoke, and the inside of an old cabin that had probably seen years of visitors come and go. We unpacked some of our things, looked around, and settled in. Nothing about the place seemed dangerous. Nothing felt wrong. There were no strange sounds, no warning signs, no reason to think the cabin would become anything other than a quiet place to sleep after a day outside. That first day passed the way a camping day is supposed to pass. We spent time near the lake, enjoyed the outdoors, and used the cabin as our little shelter. Inside the cabin, we had a small cooking fire. It was not meant to be anything dramatic, just a practical little fire to cook and keep warm. The heat from it made the room feel better, especially once the evening came in and the air cooled down. Fire has a way of making a place feel safe. It gives off light and warmth. It makes shadows move in a soft way. It makes people gather close. In a small, rustic cabin like that, the fire became the center of the room. I remember the comfort of it more than the details of what we ate. I remember that it made the cabin feel alive, as if the little room had its own heart beating inside it. By the time night came, there was still no reason to be afraid. The cabin was simple, but it did its job. The bunks were on one side, the door was on the other, and the fireplace was there with the last heat from the fire. Outside, the lake and woods were dark, but that was just part of camping. I was young enough to feel a little thrill from sleeping somewhere unfamiliar, but not truly scared. There is a difference between being nervous in a fun way and being afraid because something is wrong. That night, it was the fun kind. The kind where every creak in the woods sounds interesting, every little sound outside makes you listen for a second, and then you roll over and go back to sleep because you are tired from the day. We went to sleep thinking everything was fine. The next morning is the part I will never forget. I woke up in that one-room cabin, expecting the normal things you expect when you wake up while camping. Maybe someone moving around quietly. Maybe the smell of cold ashes from the fire. Maybe early light coming through cracks or windows. Maybe the lake outside, still and quiet. But instead, when we woke up and looked down at the concrete floor, there were snakes everywhere. Not one snake, not two, not a few near the door. There were over 100 of them. For a moment, my brain did not understand what I was seeing. The floor itself looked like it was moving. Everywhere I looked, there were long shapes crossing over each other, sliding slowly, curling near the walls, lying near the warm places, or moving across the concrete like the cabin belonged to them now. It was the kind of sight that takes a few seconds to become real. You wake up from sleep, and your mind is still soft and confused. You are not ready for fear yet. Then you look down and realize the entire floor between your bed and the door is alive. I did not have a snake phobia, and I still do not think of myself as someone who panics at the sight of one snake. But there is a very big difference between seeing one snake outside where it belongs and waking up inside a small room with more than 100 snakes on the floor. That is not a simple fear. That is the kind of fear that reaches into your body before you can think clearly. Your feet suddenly feel trapped. Your hands do not know where to go. You become aware of every inch of space around you. The cabin that felt safe the night before now felt like a cage. The worst part was the door. The bunks were on one side of the cabin, and the door was on the opposite side. That meant the only way out was across the floor, and the floor was covered in snakes. There was no easy path, no clean strip of concrete where we could just walk out. The door might as well have been on the other side of a river. We could see it, but getting to it was the problem. As a child, that distance felt huge. It was probably not very far in real terms, but when the floor between you and safety is covered with snakes, even a few steps can feel impossible. We eventually figured out that they must have come in during the night because of the warmth from the fire. The small cooking fire had made the cabin warmer than the cold outside, and the snakes had found that warmth. They had slipped in while we were sleeping, drawn by the heat we had made without thinking. That detail still bothers me because it makes the whole thing feel so simple and natural. There was no evil reason, no strange curse, no horror movie setup, just animals following warmth. We had made the cabin comfortable for ourselves, and without meaning to, we had made it attractive to them too. That is what makes nature frightening sometimes. It does not need to hate you, it does not need to plan anything. It only has to do what it does. The snakes were not trying to scare us. They were not there because of us as people. They were there because the concrete floor and the leftover heat were better than the cold outside. But that did not make it any less terrifying to wake up surrounded by them. Nature can be completely normal and still put you in danger. There were several species in that cabin. Some were venomous and some were not. That made everything worse because it meant we could not simply treat them all as harmless. I was a kid, and I did not know enough to identify every snake on the floor. Even an adult would have had to be careful. When there are that many snakes moving around together, you do not get the luxury of calmly studying each one. You do not know which one might bite. You do not know which one is just trying to get away and which one might strike if you step too close. You do not know if one is hidden under a bag, under a blanket, beside a shoe, or near the leg of the bed. And we were far from hospitals. That thought was probably stronger for the adults than it was for me at first, but I understood enough to be scared. A venomous bite is bad anywhere. A venomous bite far away from quick medical help is much worse. Out there by the lake in a rustic cabin, there was no simple solution. You could not just run into the next room. You could not call someone and expect help to arrive in minutes. You had to get out carefully, without being bitten, and then figure out what to do from there. The distance from hospitals made the cabin feel even more isolated. The lake and trees that had seemed peaceful the day before suddenly felt like they were keeping us far from safety. No one could just jump down and rush for the door. That would have been the worst thing to do. Moving fast around snakes can make a bad situation much more dangerous. The more sudden your movements are, the more likely you are to step wrong, scare one, or put your foot exactly where you should not. We had to slow down. That was hard because fear makes you want to get out immediately. Every instinct in your body says, leave now. But the only safe way out was to take our time. I remember the carefulness more than anything. Every movement had to be thought through. We had to look before putting a foot down. We had to watch the floor, watch the spaces near the bed, watch where our hands went, and pay attention to where the snakes were moving. The room had become a puzzle, and the price of a mistake could have been a painful or dangerous bite. It was not the kind of fear where you scream and run. It was the kind where everyone becomes quiet, because panic could make things worse. Even as a kid, I could feel that we had to stay controlled. The concrete floor made the snakes easy to see in some places, but that did not make it comfortable. Their bodies moved over the hard surface in a way that made the whole room feel wrong. A cabin floor is supposed to be a place where you put your feet down without thinking. That morning, the floor was no longer ours. It belonged to the snakes. They were in the open, along the walls near our belongings, and between us and the door. Some moved slowly, almost calmly, while others shifted in little bursts. Every movement made my stomach tighten. Our belongings were scattered around the cabin the way camping things always are. Bags, clothes, supplies, shoes, maybe food items, and whatever else we had brought for the trip. The night before, those things had just been our stuff. In the morning, each item could have been hiding something. A bag on the floor was not just a bag anymore. A blanket was not just a blanket. A shoe could have had a snake beside it or inside it. Picking things up became risky. Reaching down became risky. Even deciding what to take with us had to be done carefully. In the end, we left half our stuff behind, not because we wanted to, but because it was not worth it. There are moments when you realize that belongings are just belongings. They feel important until something living and dangerous is between you and them. Then they become very easy to leave. Anything we did not absolutely need stayed where it was. At that point, the only thing that mattered was getting out without anyone being bitten. Clothes could be replaced. Supplies could be replaced. But one wrong step, one bite from the wrong snake, and the whole trip could have turned into an emergency far worse than it already was. I remember being very aware of my body. When you are that young, adults usually manage the danger for you. You trust them to tell you where to go and what to do. But in that cabin, I still had to control myself. I had to listen. I had to move slowly. I had to not panic. That is a lot to ask from an 8 or 9-year-old child standing above a floor full of snakes. I wanted to get out. I wanted to be away from that room. I wanted to be outside in the open air, where the ground did not look like it was moving. But I could not just make that happen. I had to wait, watch, and follow every careful instruction. The walk to the door felt endless. Every step mattered. We had to choose places where there were fewer snakes, or at least where we could step without landing directly on one. We had to pause when they moved. We had to let them shift away. We had to keep our balance and not stumble. Stumbling would have been awful. Falling onto that floor would have been a nightmare. That thought alone made me stiff with fear. I kept imagining my foot slipping, my hand going down to catch myself, and landing near one of them. I tried not to think about it, but fear kept bringing the image back. The doorway became the most important thing in the world. It was just across the cabin, but it looked like freedom. Outside was air, space, sunlight, distance. Outside, at least, we would not be trapped in a single room with snakes covering the floor. Every step toward that door felt like getting closer to breathing again. But even once we reached it, we still had to be careful. Snakes could have been near the threshold too. They could have been tucked against the wall, or just outside. Nothing felt safe until we were fully out and away from the cabin. When we finally got outside, the relief was huge, but it was not the kind of relief that makes you laugh right away. It was the kind where you stand there and realize how tense your whole body has been. The lake was still there. The trees were still there. Morning had arrived like any other morning, but the world felt different because we knew what was inside that cabin. The peaceful little place from the day before had turned into something I wanted distance from. I could look back at it and understand that it was just a cabin, just a simple shelter by a lake, but part of me no longer trusted it. The strange thing is that the snakes were only doing what snakes do. That is what makes the memory so eerie rather than just dramatic. They found warmth. They came in. They stayed on the concrete floor because it held some of that heat. There was no mystery once you understood it, but knowing the explanation did not make it feel less frightening. Sometimes the most unsettling experiences are the ones that make perfect sense afterward. You can explain every part of it, and still the memory crawls under your skin. I still think about what would have happened if one of us had woken up in the middle of the night and stepped down without looking. That thought bothers me more than the morning itself. We were sleeping above them while they came in. At some point during the night, there may have been snakes moving quietly across the floor below us. We had no idea. If I had needed to use the bathroom, or if someone had gotten up to check the fire, or if a child had climbed down from the bunk half asleep, it could have gone very differently. In the dark, with bare feet or sleepy eyes, one wrong step could have landed on a venomous snake. That is the part that makes me feel a little sick when I remember it. We were lucky that we saw them before moving around too much. We were lucky that no one panicked and jumped down. We were lucky that we had enough light to understand what was happening. We were lucky that the door was reachable with care. At the time, I probably did not understand all the ways it could have gone wrong. As an adult, it is much easier to see them. That makes the memory sharper, not weaker. The cabin had seemed so safe when we first arrived. That is what I come back to. It had walls, a roof, beds, and a fireplace. Compared to sleeping in a tent, it felt more protected, but in a way the cabin created the problem. The warmth we made inside it pulled the snakes in. The walls kept us in the same room with them. The bunk beds lifted us above the danger while we slept. But once morning came, we had to cross the floor to escape. Everything about the setup that had seemed simple and practical became part of the fear. I do not hate snakes because of it. I know they are animals, and most of the time they want nothing to do with people. I can respect them from a distance. But respect is not the same as comfort. There is a healthy fear that comes with knowing what a venomous bite can do, especially when you are far away from help. That morning gave me that fear in a way no book or warning ever could. It taught me that even a quiet, beautiful place can become dangerous for reasons you never thought about. I can still picture the floor. That is the image that stays with me more than anything else. The hard gray concrete, the shapes moving across it, the feeling that there were too many to count properly, and the knowledge that some of them could hurt us badly. I can picture the bunk beds on one side and the door on the other. I can feel that trap distance between where we were and where we needed to go. I can remember the silence of being careful, the slow planning, the decision to leave things behind, and the relief of finally stepping outside. It was not a ghost story. It was not a story about something impossible. It was a real kind of fear. The kind that comes from nature slipping into your safe space while you sleep. One night, we went to bed in a small cabin by a lake, warmed by a cooking fire and tired from the day. The next morning, we woke up to more than 100 snakes on the floor, some venomous, some not, all of them between us and the door. We had to move slowly, think carefully, and leave half our things behind, because getting out safely mattered more than anything else. I was only 8 or 9 years old, and even now, after all these years, I can still remember how it felt to look down and realize the floor was alive. This story haunts me because I can see how easily it happened. That is the part that makes it so hard to stop thinking about. It was not a planned attack. It was not some evil person setting out to hurt strangers. It was not the kind of horror where you can point to one monster and say that everything happened because someone wanted it to happen. It was an accident, but not the kind of accident that feels small or simple. It was the kind of accident where one missed check, one unsecured part, one mistake that could have seemed ordinary in the moment, turned into something no one on that road could have imagined. That is what makes it stay in my head. The whole thing feels terrifying because it was so normal until it was not. A truck was driving down a road. Cars were coming the other way. People were going about their lives. And then, without warning, something huge and heavy swung into their path. It happened in 1995 in the UK, on the narrow and twisty roads of Cornwall. A man was driving a low-loader truck with a mechanical digger on the back. That kind of vehicle is already large and serious-looking, the sort of thing you pass carefully when you see it on a small road. A low-loader carrying heavy machinery has a certain presence. It is not like passing a normal car or even a delivery van. You notice it. It takes up space. It moves with weight behind it. But the danger in this case was not just the size of the truck or the machine it was carrying. The danger was in one part of the digger that had not been secured properly. The arm of the digger, the long metal part with the bucket at the end, was not locked down the way it should have been. The driver did not realize that. That is one of the most chilling parts of the whole story. He was not sitting there knowing something was wrong and choosing to continue. He was not aware of the devastation happening behind him or beside him. As far as he knew, he was driving a truck along the road, doing a job, moving machinery from one place to another. Maybe it felt like any other working day. Maybe he had driven loads like that before. Maybe he checked what he thought needed checking. Maybe he was thinking about the route, the bends, the traffic, or getting the job done. But he did not know that the digger arm on the back was loose enough to move. He did not know that with each turn, on those twisting Cornish roads, the arm could swing outward. That image is what makes me feel cold. The truck moving forward, the driver looking ahead, hands on the wheel, focused on the road, while behind him the digger arm slowly becomes a weapon without anyone meaning for it to be one. On a straight road, maybe it might not have happened in the same way, or maybe the danger would have been noticed sooner. But the roads in Cornwall can be narrow and winding, with bends that force vehicles close to each other. As the truck went around those bends, the unsecured arm would swing out into the path of oncoming traffic. The people coming the other way would have had almost no time to understand what they were seeing. 1 second, they would be driving along normally. The next, something heavy and metal would sweep across their lane at the height of their car roof. It is awful, because you can imagine the drivers not having a real chance. On those kinds of roads, there is often nowhere to go. You cannot simply swerve away if there is a hedge, bank, wall, ditch, or another vehicle. You cannot stop instantly if the danger appears right in front of you. And you may not even understand what the danger is until it is too late. A truck with a digger on the back might not seem unusual from a distance. You might see it coming and think only that you need to keep your side of the road. You would not expect the arm of the machine to swing out into your lane like a blade. You would not expect the bucket of the digger to be moving independently, reaching across the road while the truck itself continued forward. The bucket ripped the roofs from several cars. That detail is so horrifying that it is hard to even hold in your mind. It was not a crash in the ordinary sense. It was not two vehicles hitting head-on. It was something stranger and more sudden, almost impossible to process. The cars were struck from above, at the level where the people inside were most vulnerable. The drivers were killed instantly or nearly instantly. 5 people died. I do not know if that was 5 separate cars or if some of the victims were in the same vehicles. I also remember hearing that 2 people were injured. But the exact arrangement of the cars is not even the part that stays with me most. What stays with me is the idea that each of those people had no idea their final moment was approaching. They were just driving. That is the part that makes this feel like true horror. It happened in daylight, on a road, during something as ordinary as travel. Roads are dangerous, and everyone knows that in a general way. People worry about speeding, drunk drivers, bad weather, animals running out, or losing control on a bend. But this was different. It was a hidden danger attached to something that looked like a normal work vehicle. The people in those cars were not doing anything reckless. They were not walking into danger on purpose. They were simply in the wrong place at the exact wrong second, meeting a truck whose driver did not know that something on the back of his vehicle had become deadly. I try to imagine what it was like for the people nearby who saw what was happening. Someone must have noticed the truck passing. Someone must have heard the sound. Someone must have seen damaged cars left behind. Maybe at first, people did not understand that all the incidents were connected. One damaged car would be shocking enough. Then another. Then another. The horror would have grown as the pattern became clear. Something was moving along the road and leaving destruction behind it. But the person driving it did not know. The danger was not stopping because the driver had no reason, in his own mind, to stop. He was continuing along the route, unaware that behind him there were wrecked cars, injured people, and first responders being called into a scene that must have been almost impossible to believe. That is another part I cannot stop thinking about. The driver was completely unaware of the devastation he was leaving in his wake. Imagine being responsible for something terrible and not even knowing it as it happens. Imagine driving on, maybe checking your mirrors but not seeing the right angle, maybe feeling nothing unusual from the truck, maybe hearing no sound loud enough to make sense inside the cab. Heavy vehicles are noisy. Roads are busy. A driver may not feel the same impact through a long vehicle carrying machinery as someone in a small car would feel. So he kept going. Not because he was cruel, not because he wanted to escape. He simply did not know. And then, at some point, he had to find out. That moment must have been its own kind of nightmare. I think about him sometimes. I think about what it must have felt like when someone told him what had happened. How do you even understand that? How does a human mind take in the fact that, while you thought you were just driving for work, 5 people died because of something attached to your vehicle? It is not the same as intending harm, but the weight of it would still be unbearable. Intent does not bring people back. Saying I did not know may be true, but it does not erase the faces, the families, the road, the cars, or the fact that his ordinary workday ended in deaths he never meant to cause. That is the kind of guilt that could destroy a person. There are mistakes people can live with because they are small. There are mistakes people learn from and move past. But some mistakes are too large. Some are so permanent that they split a life in two. Before and after. Before he knew. After he knew. Before, he was just a truck driver doing a job. After, he was the man connected forever to a chain of deaths on a road in Cornwall. Even if he did not mean it, even if he had not understood what was happening, he still had to carry the knowledge. That is a terrible thing to imagine. It must be like waking up into a nightmare and realizing you were part of it before you even knew it existed. He ended up in a psychiatric hospital with PTSD. That detail makes the story even sadder, because it shows that the horror did not end when the truck stopped. It did not end when the road was cleared or when the news reports were finished. It stayed inside the people who had to live with it. For him, it must have played over and over in his mind. The route, the load, the digger arm, the moment he was told, the number of people who died, the families who lost someone, the question of whether he could have checked differently, seen something sooner, stopped earlier, prevented it somehow. Even when an accident is not intentional, the mind still looks for a way to punish itself. It asks the same questions again and again, even when there is no answer that changes anything. And it was not only him. Many first responders also needed PTSD treatment. That says a lot about how bad the scenes must have been. First responders are trained for terrible things. They see crashes, injuries, deaths, fires, and emergencies that most people never have to face. But training does not make someone immune to horror. It only helps them function while the horror is happening. Later, when the noise stops and the work is done, the mind still has to process what the eyes have seen. In this case, the scenes must have been deeply traumatic. Multiple cars, multiple victims, a strange and violent type of damage that would not look like a normal road accident. The first responders had to arrive, understand what had happened, help the injured, deal with the dead, and carry all of it with them afterward. That part matters, because tragedies do not only affect the people who die, they spread outward. They hit families, witnesses, emergency workers, investigators, hospital staff, the driver, and even people who hear about it years later and cannot stop imagining it. Each victim had a life before that road. They had people waiting for them, people who expected them to arrive, people who may have heard about an accident and prayed it was not them. Then there were the first responders who had to step into the aftermath. There were the investigators who had to piece together how something like this could happen. There was the truck driver who had to understand that he had been at the center of it without knowing. A single unsecured arm on a machine changed countless lives. What scares me is how ordinary the cause sounds. The arm of the digger was not properly secured. That is a sentence that sounds almost technical, almost simple. It is the kind of thing that could appear in a report. But behind that plain sentence is absolute devastation. That is often how real disasters are. They are not always dramatic at the start. They begin with one misstep, one loose part, one assumption, one failure in a chain that was supposed to keep everyone safe. The smaller the beginning sounds, the more horrifying the ending feels. Because it reminds you that safety depends on details most of us never think about. Every day, people drive past trucks carrying loads, machinery, lumber, pipes, containers, metal, tools, equipment, and all kinds of heavy things move along public roads. Most of the time, nothing happens. Most of the time, everything is strapped down properly, checked, and handled by people who know what they are doing. Because of that, we stop thinking about it. We trust the system around us. We trust that a load is secure. We trust that the driver knows. We trust that the vehicle coming toward us will stay in its lane and that nothing attached to it will suddenly swing into ours. But this story shows how fragile that trust can be. Not because everyone is careless, but because even one failure can be enough. I think that is why it haunts me more than some stories that are technically more violent or more dramatic. This one feels possible. It feels like something that could happen while someone is on the way to work, on the way home, going shopping, visiting family, or just driving through the countryside. There is no warning sign that your life is about to end. There is just a bend in the road and a truck coming the other way. You slow down, keep to your side, and expect the moment to pass like thousands of other passing vehicles have passed. But this time, the machine on the back moves. This time, the danger reaches across the road before you can react. The roads in Cornwall make the image worse in my mind. Twisty roads can be beautiful, but they can also be unforgiving. Hedges and banks can block your view. Bends come quickly. Vehicles appear suddenly. A large truck on a narrow road already asks for caution from everyone around it. Add a loose digger arm to that, and the road becomes a trap without anyone realizing it. The driver of the truck may have been watching the road ahead, doing what he thought was necessary to handle the bends. The drivers coming toward him may have been watching the truck itself. But the real danger was not where their eyes expected it to be. It was swinging out from the load. That mismatch between what people see and what is actually dangerous is terrifying. We look for threats in familiar ways. We expect the front of a vehicle to be the part that hits us. We expect danger to come from the direction of travel. We do not expect the side or rear of a machine to suddenly sweep across a lane. So even if a driver had a split second to see it, the brain might not understand fast enough. Sometimes people freeze not because they are weak, but because what they are seeing does not make sense. The mind spends precious time trying to identify the danger, and by the time it does, there is no time left. I also think about the families of the people who died. It must have been almost impossible for them to accept the explanation. A loved one was driving, and then they were gone because a digger arm on a passing truck was loose. It sounds unreal, like the kind of thing you would reject at first because it is too strange. If someone dies in a crash, the family may still struggle, but the idea of a crash is something people understand. This was harder to picture. A low loader, a mechanical digger, an unsecured arm, a bucket swinging into oncoming cars, 5 people dead. How do you make peace with something so random and preventable? How do you not replay the timing over and over? If they had left 5 minutes earlier, if they had taken a different road, if the truck had stopped sooner, if the arm had been secured properly, if one person had noticed. That is the cruelty of accidents like this. They are full of ifs. Everyone can see the points where things might have changed, but only after the damage is done. That kind of hindsight is painful because it gives the illusion of control. It makes the tragedy feel both avoidable and impossible to undo. The mind keeps walking backward through the chain, looking for the one place where it could have been broken. But the people who died did not have that view. They only had the road in front of them. The driver's suffering does not take away from the victim's suffering, but it is still part of the horror. I think people sometimes want accidents to have a simple villain because it makes the grief easier to aim. But this story does not offer that kind of clean answer. There was responsibility, yes, there was a failure, yes, people died because something was not secured. But the driver himself did not know he was causing it while it was happening, and that makes the whole thing feel even more tragic. He had to live with the knowledge that his vehicle had killed people while he was unaware. I cannot imagine the weight of that. It must have followed him into sleep, into waking moments, into silence, into any road he ever saw afterward. I imagine him replaying the drive, the bends, the speed, the mirrors, the load, maybe wondering whether there had been any sign, a sound, a shadow, a movement, a look from another driver, anything that could have warned him. PTSD can trap people inside moments they cannot change. It can make the past feel alive, as if the mind is still trying to go back and stop the thing from happening. For a person connected to an accident like this, that must be unbearable. Even if he was not trying to hurt anyone, the knowledge would still be there every day. 5 people were dead, and he had been behind the wheel of the truck. The first responders, too, must have carried images from that road for years. People often think of emergency workers as strong because they can do the job. But strength does not mean they do not feel it. It means they do what needs to be done while feeling it. A scene like that would have been chaotic, confusing, and deeply upsetting. There would have been damaged vehicles, blocked roads, injured survivors, witnesses in shock, and the terrible task of confirming who could be helped and who could not. Afterward, even if they went home, part of them may have stayed on that road. That is how trauma works. It does not always leave when the shift ends. The more I think about it, the more horrifying it becomes, because it shows how quickly ordinary systems can fail. Roads depend on trust. Work vehicles depend on checks. Heavy machinery depends on locks, chains, straps, and people making sure everything is secure. When all of those things work, no one notices. When one of them fails, the result can be catastrophic. And the people most affected may be complete strangers who had nothing to do with the mistake. That is what feels so unfair. The victims did not choose the risk. They were simply sharing the road. This is why the story stays with me. It is not only the deaths, though those are terrible enough. It is the strange silence around the cause. A loose arm, a swinging bucket, a driver who did not know, cars meeting the truck one by one, the devastation left behind while the truck kept moving, the delayed horror of discovery, the ruined families, the traumatized first responders, the driver ending up in a psychiatric hospital with PTSD. It is all of those pieces together that make it feel like something out of a nightmare, even though it was real. Horrifying is the only word that fits. Horrifying because 5 people died. Horrifying because others were injured. Horrifying because the people in those cars had no real chance to understand what was happening. Horrifying because the driver did not know what he was doing until it was far too late. Horrifying because a simple failure to secure part of a machine became a chain of deaths on a public road. And horrifying because it reminds you that sometimes the scariest stories are not about someone wanting to hurt you. Sometimes they are about how little it can take for a normal day to turn into a disaster. I think of that road sometimes, even though I was not there. I think of the truck moving through Cornwall in 1995, carrying a mechanical digger that should have been just another piece of machinery on its way somewhere. I think of the arm swinging out on the bends, unseen or misunderstood until it struck. I think of the people in the oncoming cars living the last ordinary seconds of their lives. I think of the driver, unaware of the destruction behind him, and then later forced to understand it all at once. And I think of the first responders who arrived after, doing their jobs in a scene that stayed with many of them long after the road was cleared. That is the kind of story that does not need exaggeration. The truth is already enough. A man drove a low-loader truck with a digger on the back. The digger arm was not properly secured. On the twisty roads of Cornwall, the arm swung into oncoming traffic. The bucket tore through the roofs of several cars. 5 people died, and others were injured. The driver did not know he was leaving devastation behind him. Later, He suffered badly enough to end up in psychiatric care with PTSD, and many of the first responders needed treatment too. It was an accident, but that does not make it less terrifying. In some ways, it makes it worse, because you can see how easily it happened. Over the hill from where I was raised, there was an old story that people did not tell loudly. It was one of those stories that belonged to the land before it belonged to any one person. The kind of story that stayed in the corners of kitchens, on front porches after dark, and in the careful pauses of older people when a certain house or road was mentioned. I heard it growing up, not as a campfire tale made to scare children, but as something the adults seemed to believe because it had happened close enough to them, or close enough to someone they knew, that laughing it off did not feel right. It was not a ghost story. There was no white figure in a window, no strange light in the woods, no voice calling from an empty room. It was worse than that, because it was about real people, a real family, and a quiet place that had once been normal until one afternoon changed it forever. The place was just over the hill, close enough that you could feel it was part of the same world I grew up in, but far enough away that it had a different mood in my mind. When you are a child, a hill can feel like a border. On one side is everything you know, your home, your yard, the roads your parents drive, the neighbors whose dogs you hear barking at night, and the fields or trees you see every day. On the other side is something else. It might only be another stretch of road, another few houses, another patch of farmland, but in a child's imagination, it can feel distant and hidden. The story from over that hill made the place feel even more separate, as if something dark had happened there and left a mark that never fully faded. It happened back in the 1930s, long before I was born. That was a different time in almost every way. Families lived more privately. People did not talk about certain problems the way they do now. If something was wrong inside a house, it often stayed inside that house until it became too large to hide. Mental illness, especially something serious, was not understood with much kindness or patience by many people. Families often did not have good help, and the help that did exist could be harsh, cold, or far away. People used words back then that we would not use now, and they made decisions that were shaped by fear, shame, religion, poverty, and a lack of options. So when people said there was a family with a son who had serious mental problems, what they meant was not only that he was difficult, they meant something had been wrong for a long time, and it had grown bad enough that the family no longer knew how to handle him at home. From the way the story was told, the family had tried to manage it for as long as they could. That is the part people often leave out when they talk about terrible things like this. A tragedy usually does not begin at the worst moment. It begins long before, in small signs people hope will pass, in arguments behind closed doors, in nights when no one sleeps, in days when the house feels tense before anyone even speaks. I imagine that family living with that tension, day after day. The father trying to keep order, the mother trying to care for her son, while also being afraid of what he might do or what he might become. The other family members learning to move carefully around him, never knowing what mood they would find him in. Maybe there were calm days when everyone told themselves it was not as bad as they feared. Maybe there were bad days when they looked at each other and knew something had to change. By the time the story reached the point everyone remembered, it had gotten bad enough that they had decided to put him in a home. In the 1930s, that was a heavy decision. It was not like arranging regular medical care or finding a safe place with modern support. Putting someone in a home back then could mean sending them away to a place that felt final. Families might feel guilt, shame, relief, and fear all at once. I can imagine the parents arguing about it quietly, maybe late at night when the son was asleep or when they thought he was asleep. I can imagine the mother not wanting to let go, because even if her son frightened her, he was still her child. I can imagine the father feeling that there was no other choice, that the safety of everyone in the house had to come first. It must have been an awful decision, the kind no parent wants to make. The day it happened, the father took the rest of the family into town. That part of the story always bothered me. It sounds so ordinary. Going into town was something people did for errands, supplies, business, or visits. It could have been a simple trip. The road into town, the dust or gravel, the sound of the vehicle, the rest of the family sitting together and thinking about whatever needed to be done. Maybe they were going to make arrangements. Maybe they were trying to get help. Maybe they were simply leaving the mother and son alone for what they thought would be a short while because someone had to stay with him and she was the one who always did. The story does not give every detail, and maybe no one really knew all of them afterward. But the shape of the day is clear enough. The father and the others left. The mother stayed behind with the boy. That is the part where my mind slows down every time I think about it. The house must have become very quiet after the others left. A family house has a certain noise when everyone is there. Footsteps, voices, doors opening, dishes, chores, small arguments, and the normal movement of people sharing space. When most of the family leaves, the silence changes. Suddenly the rooms feel larger. Every sound stands out. If the mother was already uneasy, she would have felt that quiet settle around her. She may have gone about her chores, trying to keep things normal. Maybe she cooked, cleaned, washed something, checked on the stove, or looked out the window toward the road waiting for the family to come back. Maybe she spoke gently to her son. Maybe she tried not to show fear. Mothers can be brave in ways that no one sees, especially when the danger is inside their own home. I wonder if she knew something was wrong that day. Not in the general way she probably always knew, but in a sharper way. Did the air feel different? Did he look at her differently? Did he stop speaking? Did he follow her from room to room? Did she try to calm him? Did she think about leaving the house? Or did she believe she could manage him until the others returned? These are the questions that make the story so hard to shake. Because once you know what happened, every possible moment before it feels full of warning. But she did not have the story the way we have it now. She was living it second by second, inside the house, with her son, waiting for the rest of the family to come back. The old house itself became part of the fear in my mind. I do not know every detail of it, but I always pictured a rural home from that time, set back from the road, with fields or woods nearby. A porch, plain rooms, and windows that looked out over land that could seem peaceful and empty at the same time. Houses in the country can feel safe during the day, especially when the sun is up and the family is around. But they can also feel terribly isolated when something goes wrong. There is no quick help just outside the door, no neighbor close enough to hear every shout, no police car minutes away the way people might expect now. If a person was trapped in trouble inside a house like that, the distance itself became part of the danger. Whatever happened between the mother and her son after the family left, the story does not stretch it out. Maybe no one ever knew the full sequence. Maybe it happened fast. Maybe it built slowly. Maybe she tried to stop him, talk him down, or run. Maybe there was a moment when she realized the person in front of her was no longer someone she could reach with a mother's voice. That is one of the most frightening thoughts in the whole story. Not just violence, but the breaking of the bond that should have been strongest. A mother and her child, alone in a house, and something inside him so badly broken that even she was not safe. When the father and the rest of the family came back from town, they must have expected to return to the same house they had left. Maybe they were tired from the trip. Maybe someone was carrying something from town. Maybe the younger ones were talking or complaining. Maybe the father was thinking about the hard choice ahead and what it would mean to send his son away. Then they reached the house, and the normal world ended. They found the boy walking around the house with his mother's head on a broomstick. Even now, that sentence feels too awful to sit with for long. It is the kind of detail that makes people go quiet, because there is no proper response to it. It is not just the death. It is the way the body was treated afterward. It is the image of the family coming home and seeing him like that, moving around the house or near it, holding something so impossible and so horrifying that their minds must have refused to understand it at first. The mother they had left alive, the woman who had stayed behind, the center of the home, reduced to something no person should ever have to see, and held by her own son as if he had crossed into a place beyond all ordinary human feeling. I cannot imagine what the father felt in that moment. There are things a person can recover from, and then there are things that divide life into before and after. Coming home to that would have shattered everything. He had left his wife with their son. Maybe he had believed she would be safe for a short time. Maybe he had trusted that they had just a little longer before the boy had to be taken away. Maybe he had already been carrying guilt about the decision to put him in a home. Then he returned and found that the danger they feared had already arrived, and it had taken the worst possible form. How could anyone live with that image afterward? How could the other family members forget it? How could that house ever be just a house again? Stories like this do not always carry every fact clearly through time. Details change depending on who tells them. Some parts may become sharper, some may become blurred, but the core stayed the same. A family over the hill, a troubled son, a decision to send him away. The father taking the others into town, the mother staying behind, and the family returning to a nightmare. That core was enough. It did not need extra ghosts or legends. The horror was already complete. Growing up near a place connected to a story like that changes the way you think about the landscape. The hill was not only a hill. The road beyond it was not only a road. Somewhere over there, people had lived with fear inside their own home until fear became real. Somewhere over there, a mother had been left alone with her son. Somewhere over there, a family had come back from town and seen something that no family should ever see. Even if the house was gone by the time I heard the story, or changed, or owned by someone else, the land itself seemed to remember. That is how local tragedies work. They become attached to the place. People may not know the names anymore, but they know the direction. Over the hill, back in the 1930s, that family, that boy, that mother. What makes the story so disturbing to me is how quiet it is until the end. There is no warning from outside, no storm, no stranger, no chase through the woods. Just a family trying to deal with something they did not have the tools to handle. It feels painfully human. A mother stays home. A father goes to town. The family comes back. That ordinary structure makes the horror worse because it shows how quickly life can collapse inside the walls of a home. The same kitchen where meals were made, the same rooms where children slept, the same yard where people worked and walked, became part of a memory so dark that people were still repeating it decades later. It also carries a different kind of sadness beneath the fear. The son was clearly not well. Whatever was happening inside his mind had taken him far from anything normal or safe. But knowing that does not soften what happened. It only makes the whole thing more tragic. There were no winners in that house. A woman lost her life in the most horrible way. A family lost their mother and wife. A father lost the world he knew. The son, already deeply unwell, became the cause of a nightmare that would follow his family forever. And the people who came after, people like me, inherited the story as a warning about what can happen when danger grows quietly behind a closed door. I think about the mother most. Not the terrible image at the end, but the woman before it. I think about her standing in the house that day, maybe looking out toward the road, maybe listening for the sound of the family returning. I think about how many times she must have cared for that boy when he was younger, how many times she fed him, washed his clothes, worried over him, defended him, and hoped he might get better. Mothers often hold on to hope longer than anyone else. Even when others are afraid, a mother may still remember the child before the illness, before the violence, before the fear. She may have seen him not only as what he had become, but as what he had once been. That makes her final moments even more heartbreaking. She was not alone with a stranger. She was alone with her son. And I think about the family returning, because that is the moment the story forces you to stand in. Imagine coming back from town, maybe feeling the relief of being home, only to see something outside or inside the house that your mind cannot accept. Imagine the first scream. Imagine the father rushing forward and then stopping, because there is no way to undo what has happened. Imagine the other family members frozen in place, some too young to understand fully, but old enough to know they have seen something that will never leave them. Imagine the silence after the first shock, when everyone realizes the mother is gone and the boy is still there. That is why the story never felt like a simple, scary tale to me. It felt like a wound, a dark piece of history from just over the hill, passed down because people could not forget it, and maybe did not want others to forget it either. There are stories people tell for entertainment, and there are stories people tell because the truth is so disturbing that it demands to be remembered. This one always belonged to the second kind. It was not fun to hear. It did not make anyone laugh nervously and move on. It left a heavy feeling behind, the kind that makes a familiar place feel suddenly unfamiliar. Even now, when I think about the area where I was raised, I can picture that hill. I can picture the idea of what waited beyond it. Not as a place on a map, but as a memory carried by people who lived nearby. The story has the shape of something from another time, but the fear inside it is not old. It still works because it touches something basic, the fear that the people closest to us can become strangers, the fear that help can be too far away, the fear that a normal day can hide a terrible ending. It reminds you that horror does not always come from outside the home. Sometimes it grows inside it, quietly, while everyone hopes they still have time. And in that family's case, they did not have time. They had reached the point where they knew the boy had to be put in a home. They had already accepted that something was wrong enough that he could no longer remain there safely. But the decision came just a little too late. The father left with the rest of the family. The mother stayed behind. By the time they returned, the worst thing imaginable had already happened. That is the part that makes the story so chilling. It feels like a door closing just before anyone can reach it. A family standing on the edge of action, only to find that tragedy had moved faster than they did. Over the hill from where I was raised, that story lived on. Not because it needed decoration, and not because anyone had to make it scarier than it already was. The plain version was enough. In the 1930s, there was a family with a son who had serious mental problems. It had gotten so bad that they were going to put him in a home. The father took the rest of the family to town, and the mother stayed with the boy. When they came back, they found him walking around the house with his mother's head on a broomstick. That was the story. That was all it took. And once you heard it, the hill never felt like just a hill again. The audio is haunting in a way that is hard to explain unless you have heard something like it before. It is not haunting because of music or screams in the way people imagine when they think of horror. It is haunting because it sounds real. It sounds ordinary at first, almost too ordinary. Like men just trying to understand what happened during a job that was supposed to be controlled, planned, and safe enough to finish. Then, in a matter of seconds, that normal sound turns into pure confusion. You can hear the change in their voices before your mind fully understands the situation. At first, they are not even panicking the way you would expect people to panic. They sound shocked. They sound like their brains are still trying to catch up with their bodies. Something has happened so fast that there is no time for fear to arrive properly. There is only disbelief. Then one of them shouts, "We're inside the pipe." And that is the moment that stays with you. I cannot imagine being in that situation. I have tried to picture it, but every time I do, my mind pulls away from it. There are certain kinds of fear that are too big to hold for more than a few seconds. Being trapped in a dark, narrow space is already terrifying. Being trapped somewhere deep inside an industrial pipe after being pulled in by a force you cannot fight is something else entirely. It is not like being lost in a room or stuck in an elevator where someone might open the doors. It is not like being in a car crash where everything is broken but still visible around you. Inside a pipe, there is nothing. There is no sky, no open space, no clear direction, no safe corner to crawl into. There is only metal around you, darkness ahead, darkness behind, and the terrible knowledge that you are somewhere no human being is supposed to be. That is what makes the audio so disturbing. You are not watching a scene from a movie. You are not hearing actors pretend to be scared. You are hearing real people in the first moments after their world has changed completely. One moment, they are working. The next moment, they have been taken by something invisible. Not a monster, not a person, not anything with a face. Just pressure, just force, just the kind of hidden danger that sits quietly inside machines and systems until one small failure gives it a chance to move. And when it moves, it does not care who is in the way. It does not pause. It does not give anyone time to understand. It just takes them. The worst part is how fast it happens. That is what I keep thinking about. They did not have time to prepare themselves. They did not have time to say goodbye, or even to fully understand that they were in serious danger. It happened so quickly that at first they could not even process where they were. That is why the shouting is so chilling. We're inside the pipe. It is not just a statement, it is the sound of realization. It is the moment when the mind finally catches up and tells the body the truth. They were not near the pipe anymore. They were not beside it. They were not looking into it from a safe distance. They were inside it. There is something deeply unnatural about that sentence. People are not meant to be inside pipes like that. Pipes are made for water, gas, oil, pressure, flow, and movement. They are built to carry things from one place to another, sealed away from the world. When you hear someone shout that they are inside one, your mind immediately understands that something has gone horribly wrong. It is such a simple sentence, but it carries so much fear. It means they have been pulled somewhere they should never have gone. It means they are trapped inside a system that was not designed for rescue. It means the space around them does not belong to them. It belongs to the machine. I keep thinking about the moment right before it happened. I imagine how normal everything must have felt. Maybe they were focused on the work. Maybe they were talking to each other in that practical way people do when they are doing a dangerous job, but have done enough training to keep calm. There may have been noise around them, the sound of equipment, water, metal. breathing, or voices through communication gear. Maybe they were tired. Maybe one of them was thinking about going home later. Maybe another was just waiting for the task to be finished. That is what makes true fear so different from fiction. In real life, people are almost never ready when the worst moment of their life arrives. It comes in the middle of something normal. Then something changes. Maybe it starts as a pull. Maybe at first it feels like the water or pressure moving harder than it should. Maybe there is 1 second where the body knows before the mind does. 1 second where someone feels themselves being dragged and thinks, no, this can't be happening. Then the force takes over. Once that kind of pressure has you, it is not like fighting a person. There is no grip to break. There is no arm to push away. It is everywhere at once. It pulls with a strength that does not get tired. You can kick, grab, twist, and fight, but the force is not angry. It is not emotional. It is just stronger than you. That helplessness is what makes the whole thing so horrifying. There are many scary situations where people can at least try to do something. They can run from an attacker. They can hide from someone outside the house. They can call the police. They can lock a door, break a window, climb, shout, or fight back. But inside a pipe, after being pulled in by pressure, what can you do? Every choice is bad. Every movement is limited. You are trapped in a place where even turning around might be impossible. You may not know how far you have been pulled. You may not know if the way back is clear. You may not know if anyone outside understands where you are. You may not even know if rescue is possible. That is why the voices on the audio are so hard to forget. They are not just scared. They are trying to think. That is the human part that hurts the most. Even in a nightmare, even after something impossible has happened, people still try to solve it. They try to talk. They try to explain. They try to make sense of the space around them. We're inside the pipe. Is not only fear, it is information. It is a warning. It is them telling the world or each other what has happened. It is the kind of thing someone says when they still believe that if the situation can be understood, maybe it can be fixed. But some situations become bigger than understanding. That is the part that makes me feel cold when I think about it. The men inside that pipe were not just dealing with fear. They were dealing with time. Every second mattered. Every delay outside mattered. Every wrong guess mattered. The people outside may have been confused too. They may have been trying to figure out what happened, where the men went, how far they had been pulled, whether it was safe to attempt a rescue, and what equipment would be needed. But from inside the pipe, none of that would matter in the same way. From inside, time would not feel like planning. It would feel like waiting in the dark. I keep imagining the sound inside that space. It must have been awful. A pipe can change sound. Voices bounce. Breathing becomes louder. Every movement can echo back at you in a strange way, making the space feel both small and endless at the same time. If there was water around them, every splash or shift would have sounded close and threatening. If they had gear on, their own breathing may have been loud in their ears. And underneath all of it, there would be the knowledge that they were surrounded by metal. Not walls like a room, not rock like a cave, but metal shaped into a tunnel, smooth and hard and cold, built for pressure, not comfort. The darkness is another part I cannot stop thinking about. Even if they had lights, lights can fail. Lights can point the wrong way. Lights can make things worse by showing only a small circle of what is around you, while everything beyond that circle stays black. A pipe does not have windows. It does not have landmarks. It does not have familiar shapes to calm your mind. It is just length. It is just direction. You might know that one way leads back out, but knowing that does not mean you can reach it. You might hear someone near you, but not know exactly where they are. You might hear voices from outside, or you might hear nothing at all. That silence would be almost as frightening as the shouting. There is a kind of silence that feels empty, and there is a kind that feels like the world has forgotten you. Being inside a pipe must have created that second kind. The outside world would still exist. People would still be standing somewhere above or beyond the pipe. The sky would still be there. The ground, the air, the open space, the normal world would all still be close in one way, but unreachable in another. That is the horror of being trapped. It is not only that you are somewhere dangerous, it is that safety may be near enough to imagine, but too far to touch. When I heard about them shouting to each other, that detail bothered me more than anything. It means they were still aware of one another. They were not alone, and in some ways that might have helped. Hearing another human voice in that kind of darkness might be the only thing keeping you from falling apart. But it also makes it worse, because you are not only scared for yourself, you are hearing the fear of the people with you. You are trying to stay calm for them, while knowing they are trying to do the same for you. You are trapped together, and every word carries the same question underneath it. What now? That question must have been everywhere. What now? Do we move? Do we stay still? Can they hear us? Are they coming? How far inside are we? Is there air? Is there a way out? Is the pressure still active? Are we safe here for a few minutes? Or is this getting worse? The mind can ask 100 questions in a few seconds when it is scared, and none of them bring comfort. That is what real panic feels like. It is not always screaming without control. Sometimes it is the brain working too fast, searching for one clear answer and finding none. What makes the audio so powerful is that it catches the beginning of that fear. It catches the raw moment before the story becomes a report, before it becomes an incident, before people talk about it from a distance. When you read about something later, it becomes organized. There are times, places, causes, explanations, and details. People write it down in a clean order because that is how we try to understand tragedy. But audio does not work that way. Audio keeps the confusion alive. It lets you hear the exact moment when no one has had time to shape the event into words yet. You hear people inside the moment, not after it. That is why it gives me chills. The line "we're inside the pipe" has stayed in my head because it is the kind of sentence that should not exist. It sounds almost impossible, but it was real. It makes you think about how fragile safety can be, especially around places and machines most of us never see closely. We live our lives surrounded by systems we trust without thinking about them. Pipes, valves, tanks, pumps, engines, pressure lines, power systems, construction sites, tunnels, and machinery all work quietly in the background. Most of the time, they do exactly what they are supposed to do. But when something goes wrong, the danger can be instant and overwhelming. I think that is why this story feels different from ordinary fear. There is no villain to hate. There is no ghost to explain away. There is no creature hiding in the dark. The horror comes from something real and mechanical, something built by humans, but no longer human once it starts moving. A pipe does not know there are people inside it. Pressure does not understand fear. Metal does not soften because someone is shouting. That coldness makes the whole situation feel even more terrible. It is fear without mercy, but also without intention. And still, what I remember most is not the machine. It is the voices. Human voices in the middle of something inhuman. Men trying to tell each other what happened. Men trying to stay connected in a place that should have separated them from everything. That is the part that makes the audio so hard to forget. You can hear the moment their reality changes. You can hear the shock, the disbelief, and the first edge of panic. You can hear them trying to understand something no one should ever have to understand from the inside. I do not think I could stay calm in that situation. I do not think most people could. Just imagining the pipe around me makes my chest feel tight. Imagining the darkness, the lack of space, the confusion, the sound of other voices calling out, and the terrible question of whether anyone outside knows exactly where I am is enough to make my stomach turn. It is one of those scenarios that feels like a nightmare because it removes almost every normal way a person can protect themselves. You cannot simply walk out. You cannot see clearly. You cannot rely on space. You cannot trust that the path behind you is open. All you can do is wait, shout, think, breathe, and hope that the people outside can reach you before the situation becomes worse. That is why the audio is haunting. It is not just because people were scared. It is because of how quickly ordinary work turned into something unimaginable. It is because they did not even realize what had happened at first. It is because the human mind needs time to understand danger, and they were given almost none. It is because of that one sentence, shouted in fear and disbelief, that says everything without needing to explain anything more. We're inside the pipe. Once you hear that, you understand the horror immediately. You understand the darkness, the metal, the pressure, the helplessness, and the impossible feeling of being trapped somewhere no person should ever be. Some stories scare you because they feel distant, like they belong to haunted houses, deep forests, or old legends. This one scares me because it feels real in the coldest way. It reminds you that horror can happen in daylight, at work, with trained people, in a place full of equipment and procedures. It can happen before anyone has time to react. It can happen so fast that the first few seconds are not even screams, but confusion. And by the time everyone understands, the people at the center of it are already somewhere they should never have been, calling out from inside a pipe, hoping someone can hear them. One day, I was at my temp job, doing the kind of work that was so normal and forgettable that I probably would not remember anything about that day, if not for what happened. It was not an exciting job. It was not the kind of place where you expected anything unusual to happen. It was just an office, with desks, phones, papers, filing cabinets, dull lighting, and people moving through the day the way people do when they are waiting for the clock to reach lunch or the end of the shift. I was a temp, so I was not deeply connected to the place. I knew some faces, knew a few names, knew where I was supposed to sit, and knew what task I had been given. That was about it. I came in, did my work, kept to myself, and tried to get through the day without causing trouble or drawing attention. It was the kind of office where the loudest thing was usually a phone ringing or somebody asking where a form had been put. I remember being in my office when the announcement came over the PA system. At first, it was just a voice from the speakers, the kind of sound you hear in office buildings, schools, stores, and other public places all the time. Usually those announcements are boring. They tell people about meetings, fire drills, parking issues, or some small change in schedule. You hear them without really listening, because most of the time they are not meant for you in any serious way. But this announcement was different. There was something in the voice that made me stop what I was doing. I do not remember every small detail of how it sounded, but I remember the message very clearly. Everybody was told to stay in their office, lock the door, and not come out under any circumstances until they were told to. For a second, I just sat there. I did not know what to think. The words were simple, but they did not fit the normal shape of the day. Stay in your office. Lock the door. Do not come out. Under any circumstances. Those are not words you hear during a regular workday, unless something is very wrong. But because I had no idea what was happening, my mind did not jump straight to the worst possible answer. It started looking for smaller explanations first. Maybe there was a drill I had not been told about. Maybe there was a chemical spill somewhere in the building. Maybe there was a problem with a person outside. Maybe it was some security matter that had nothing to do with me. When you are confused, your brain tries to protect you by making the situation feel smaller than it is. It gives you safe reasons before it lets the terrifying ones in. Still, I did what the voice said. I got up and locked the office door. The sound of the lock clicking felt louder than it should have. Then I looked at the door, and suddenly the lock did not feel like enough. It was just a regular office door, not a heavy security door. It was not made to stop anything serious. It was the same kind of door people opened and closed all day without thinking. So I grabbed a chair and shoved it under the doorknob. I do not know if it would have helped much, but at that moment it felt better than doing nothing. It made the room feel a little more mine, a little more protected, even though deep down I knew a chair under a doorknob was not a real answer to whatever had caused that announcement. After that, I did the only thing I could think to do. I got down on the floor and sat in the knee hole of my desk, tucked under it like a child hiding during a storm. There was something strange about being an adult at work and suddenly sitting on the floor under a desk. It made the whole situation feel unreal. A few minutes earlier, I had been doing ordinary office work. Now, I was locked in, hiding behind wood and drawers, trying to stay quiet without knowing who or what I was hiding from. I had no information. That was one of the worst parts. Nobody had said there was a fire. Nobody had said there was a dangerous person. Nobody had explained anything. The announcement had only given instructions. The fear had to fill in the empty space on its own. I had brought a book with me that day to read during lunch, so I picked it up and opened it. That part might sound strange, but I think people do odd things when they are scared and do not know what else to do. Reading gave me something to put my eyes on. It gave my hands something to hold. It gave my mind a place to go that was not the locked door, not the chair under the knob, not the silent hallway outside, and not the strange voice on the PA system telling us not to come out. I sat there on the floor under my desk and tried to read like everything was normal. I do not know how much of the book I actually understood. My eyes moved over the words, but every small sound from outside pulled me away from the page. The office felt different after the announcement. It was not only quiet. Offices are quiet sometimes. This was a tense kind of quiet, the kind where you become aware of every little noise because you are waiting for something to happen. The air itself seemed to change. The hum of the lights became more noticeable. The desk felt bigger over me. The door seemed too thin. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear my clothes shift when I moved. I remember trying not to make noise, even though I still did not know what danger there was. That is how fear works. It teaches your body to obey before your mind has any facts. I kept looking at the bottom of the door. There was a small gap there, just enough to see a thin strip of light from the hallway. It became the most important part of the room. I watched it without meaning to. I watched for shadows. I watched for movement. I watched to see if someone's feet would appear outside the door. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, and my whole body would tighten. Maybe it was a door closing somewhere far away. Maybe it was a muffled voice. Maybe it was nothing at all. Fear can make a building seem alive. It can turn pipes, vents, footsteps and distant sounds into signs. The longer I sat there, the harder it became to trust my own ears. Time slowed down in a way I still remember. An hour is not that long when you are busy. It can disappear during work without you even noticing. But an hour inside a locked office, sitting on the floor, not knowing whether it is safe to move, feels much longer. It stretches out. Every minute feels separate. I would read a few lines, then look at the door. I would listen. I would adjust my position because the floor was uncomfortable. Then I would freeze again because even the small sound of moving felt too loud. My back and legs started to feel stiff. The book became more like a shield than something to read. I held it because holding it made me feel less empty-handed. The strangest part was that I still did not really feel the full weight of what was happening. Not then. I was scared, but it was the confused kind of scared. I did not know enough to be truly terrified. Without the truth, the danger stayed blurry. It could have been serious, or it could have been some over-careful security procedure. It could have been happening on the other side of the building. It could have already been over. I did not know. So my mind kept moving between fear and calm. Between this is probably nothing, and why would they tell us not to come out under any circumstances if this was nothing? That back and forth was exhausting. I also remember thinking about the other people in the building. I did not know where everyone was. I did not know who had offices with doors, who was in open areas, who had been in the hallway, who had gone to the restroom, who had been near the entrance, or who might not have heard the announcement clearly. That made me uneasy. I was behind a locked door with a chair under the handle, but not everyone may have had that. Some people might have been caught away from their desks. Some might have been in meeting rooms. Some might have been in places where there was nowhere good to hide. I wondered if they were all sitting quietly too, trying to understand what I was trying to understand. At some point, the building became so still that it almost felt abandoned. That was worse than noise in some ways. Noise would have at least given my imagination something real to work with. Silence gave it too much room. I pictured someone walking slowly through the hallway. I pictured someone trying doors. I pictured someone standing outside my office, listening. Then I would tell myself to stop. I would look back at the book and force myself to read another sentence. I remember feeling almost embarrassed by how scared I was because I still had no proof that there was anything outside the door. But fear does not wait for proof. It comes from the possibility. I do not know exactly what I expected to happen when the all clear came, but after about an hour, another announcement came over the PA system. The voice said it was safe, that we could come out, or that the situation was clear. I cannot remember the exact wording anymore, but I remember the feeling. My body did not relax right away. In fact, hearing the all clear almost made me more aware of how tense I had been. I stayed still for a moment, as if I needed to make sure I had heard correctly. Then I crawled out from under the desk, stood up, and moved the chair away from the door. Opening that door felt strange. The hallway outside looked like the same hallway as before, but it no longer felt the same. Nothing about it had changed in a visible way, and that made it feel even stranger. The walls were still there, the lights were still on, the floor still looked normal. But now I knew something had happened, even if I still did not know what. People began coming out of offices the way people do after a storm warning, looking around, speaking quietly, trying to read each other's faces. There was that odd office behavior where everyone is trying to act calm because they do not know how serious they are allowed to be yet. After that, I went back to whatever task I had been doing before the announcement. That sounds almost unbelievable now, but that is what happened. Workplaces have a way of pulling people back into routine Even after something frightening, there are still papers, there are still phones, there are still jobs to do. And because I did not yet know the truth, the whole thing still felt like a strange interruption instead of what it really was. I sat back down and tried to work, but the room felt different. The desk was no longer just a desk, it was the place I had hidden. The door was no longer just a door, it was something I had locked, because someone told me not to come out under any circumstances. Later, we found out what had actually happened. A disgruntled former employee had come back with a Thompson submachine gun and started shooting people. That was the moment the fear landed fully. Not during the announcement, not while I was under the desk, not even when I opened the door after the all clear. It was later, when the explanation finally reached us. Up until then, the danger had been a shadow. Once we found out the truth, that shadow became solid. A former employee, a gun, shooting people. Suddenly, every second of that hour changed in my memory. The locked door mattered more. The chair under the doorknob mattered more. The silence in the hallway mattered more. The thin strip of light under the door mattered more. The fact that I had been sitting there reading a book while someone had come into the workplace with a weapon felt almost impossible to understand. I think that is one of the most disturbing parts about it. During the lockdown, I had been afraid, but I had also been calm enough to read. I had treated it like something serious but distant, something I could wait out. Then later I learned that the danger had not been vague at all. It had been real. It had been in the building. It had a person attached to it. It had intent. It had already hurt people. I had been sitting on the floor, trying to keep myself occupied, while something terrible was happening close enough that the PA system had to tell everyone to lock themselves in. There is a strange guilt that can come after something like that, even when you have done nothing wrong. I was safe in that office. Other people were not. I was able to hide, wait, and walk out. Other people had been in the path of the person who came back. That kind of knowledge sits heavily. It makes you replay the day and wonder where everyone else was when the announcement came. It makes you think about timing. What if I had been in the hallway? What if I had gone to get coffee? What if I had been in the restroom? What if I had been near the entrance? What if I had ignored the announcement for a few seconds longer? What if the door had not locked? What if the chair had not held? Even if none of those things happened, your mind still visits them. The whole event also changed the way I thought about ordinary places. Before that, an office felt like one of the safest places in the world. Not comfortable, maybe not exciting, but safe in a boring way. Offices are full of routine. People complain about work, answer phones, type, file things, make copies, drink bad coffee, and wait for lunch. The danger in an office usually feels small, maybe a paper cut, a rude supervisor, a stressful deadline, or a bad day with customers. You do not walk into a temp job thinking you might need to hide under a desk because someone with a weapon has entered the building. But after something like that, you understand that ordinary places are only ordinary until they are not. The same hallway where people walked with coffee cups can become a place you listen to in fear. The same door you never noticed can become the only thing between you and danger. The same PA system that might normally announce meetings can become the voice telling you to lock yourself in and not come out. Nothing has to look different for everything to change. I still think about the phrase, "under any circumstances." That was the part of the announcement that made my stomach drop even before I knew why. It was not casual. It was not a suggestion. It was not "please remain in your offices." It was stronger than that. Do not come out under any circumstances until you are told to. That wording carries a warning inside it. It means whatever is happening outside your door might be worse than your curiosity, worse than your confusion, worse than your need to know. It means staying hidden is safer than trying to understand. And the truth is, that instruction may have saved lives. If people had opened doors and wandered into the hallways trying to find out what was happening, things could have been much worse. Curiosity is natural. When something strange happens, people want to look. They want to ask someone. They want to step outside and see. But in that situation, curiosity could have been deadly. The announcement cut through that instinct. It told everyone to stop, lock down, and wait. I still think about how different things might have been if that warning had come too late, or if people had not listened. When I remember that day, I do not remember the work I was doing. I do not remember what I ate for lunch, or if I ever even ate it. I do not remember much about the people I worked with, or the layout of the building beyond my office, my desk, and that door. But I remember the PA announcement. I remember locking the door. I remember forcing the chair under the knob. I remember sitting on the floor in the knee hole of my desk with a book in my hands. I remember trying to read while part of me listened to the hallway. I remember how long that hour felt. And I remember the feeling when we learned what had really happened. That is what makes it so chilling. The most terrifying part was not some dramatic moment where I saw the danger with my own eyes. I never did. The terror came afterward, when I realized how close it had been while I was sitting there in the quiet. Sometimes fear does not arrive all at once. Sometimes it waits until the facts come in. Sometimes you survive something before you even understand what you survived. And then, later, when someone tells you the truth, your mind goes back and fills in the missing pieces. It takes the silence, the locked door, the chair under the knob, the hour on the floor, and the voice on the PA system. And suddenly, all of it becomes real. I cannot forget that. I cannot forget how normal the day was before the announcement. I cannot forget how quickly a boring temp job turned into a lockdown. I cannot forget the feeling of sitting under that desk, reading a book I probably was not really reading, waiting for someone to tell me it was safe to come out. And I cannot forget finding out later that a former employee had walked in with a Thompson submachine gun and started shooting people. It is the kind of thing that stays in your mind because it proves how thin the wall can be between an ordinary day and a nightmare. One moment you are working. The next, a voice over a speaker is telling you to lock the door and hide. And only later do you understand that the nightmare was not somewhere far away. It was right there, on the other side of the walls, while you sat on the floor and listened to the silence. The stories may be over, but some nights do not end when the video does. The people you heard tonight were not looking for fear. They were living normal lives until one moment changed the way they saw the world around them. Tell me in the comments which story stayed with you the longest. Subscribe to Nockmeyer Witness for more true accounts from people who saw something they wish they could forget. Good night. And if you wake up suddenly, do not assume it was just a dream.